What I know now is that there were a lot of people out there that loved Robbie. I loved him too because he was wonderful. It's not fair that Robbie's not here. He was only 25, and he had his whole life ahead of him. But I made the choice. I took his life, and there's nothing I can do to undo it.
This is a true story. I started off like that.
I just wanted to rebel. I wanted to cause chaos. I looked over. We're gonna see who kills who.
I made the choice. I took his life.
It's something that I've never intended to do. I wish I didn't do.
I knew I was going to get out of that car and murder those two men.
And as he kneeled in front of me, all I remember is pulling the trigger.
I killed them both. I had stabbed them to death.
Oh, goodness.
Doesn't help. See, it's difficult to get it in the right position.
Yeah, it's weird.
My name is Lindsay Haugen. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I enjoyed going to church. I love to study the Bible, and I love to sing. In high school, I became very rebellious, and I started to do things that maybe I would have said no to before. I started smoking marijuana and hanging out with a different crowd. Around 15, I started to run away from home. I spent the rest of the time in Portland on the streets, living with a very rough crowd, and I went straight from trying marijuana a couple of times to taking methamphetamines with a needle. Well, from there it became heroin, and I realized that I was addicted. I was probably 16. One day I decided to take a pregnancy test, and it turns out that I've been pregnant for 3 months, and I had just turned 17. I changed right then. I stopped using drugs, and I wanted to be a parent. I wanted to do well, and I wanted to take care of my son. I loved basic training. I loved the uniform. I loved being able to do more push-ups than the boys, and it was probably some of the best times in my life. I met this man in the end of 2013. He was in the Army as well. Almost immediately, he was mean to me when he drank whiskey. He would lose his mind over things that didn't even matter, that weren't real, that he would make up in his head. He told me that he didn't like my work because there were too many attractive men there. And I tried to tell him I'm used to it. This is what I've always worked around, and it doesn't affect me. I don't even notice them. But it didn't matter. It made him crazy. He hit me while I was driving a couple of times, just trying to get me to say what he wanted me to say. He just wanted to hear me tell him that I was not being faithful. I remember nights of him throwing me on the floor and spitting chewed up food on me, pouring beer on my head, raping me in all sorts of ways, and calling me dirty, calling me names that I wouldn't repeat. And it got worse. I remember one time he spit on me while I was in the bathroom. And so I stood up, and I knew that he blocked the only way out. And so I lifted my arm to swing at him, and he grabbed my hand. And then he grabbed my other hand, and he crushed him. I screamed until he started mocking my screams. And so I stopped screaming, and I looked him in the eye, and I felt my hand break. And he put me in a chokehold. And I said, if you're gonna do this, please don't let me wake up, because I can't do this anymore. And so he held me in that chokehold and made me look at myself in the mirror and said, watch yourself die. And it went dark. I found myself at home with no one to talk to but my dog, drinking a lot. I would wake up and I would drink until I went to sleep, and I would wake up and drink again. I felt crazy. So when I met Robbie, I had just gotten out of a tough relationship, and he had just gotten out of rehab in June of that year. But I didn't know that. What I knew is that there was this beautiful smile sitting in a big pile of empty beer cans on the floor with no shirt on and dreadlocks and just very carefree. He leaned back on his hands and just went, hi. And there was just kind of this instant connection. Robbie embraced what he called a traveler lifestyle. But he really lived it a lot harder than a lot of people did. He would hop freight trains and ride to wherever they were going, hitchhike, whatever it was, just traveling, never really staying in one place for a long time. And I said, I'll give you a place to stay. You don't have to do anything. Just be here when I get home. And he said, I just can't stay in one place any longer. I need to go. And I said, okay, then I'll come with you. There were times when we'd be on the road and I'd be singing to him, and he'd just look at me and say, I just love you. And I just adored him. He was my best friend. And there were times when I would expect him to treat me poorly, or to accuse me of something, or to think badly of me. And he just wouldn't. And I treasured it. I loved it so much. But there was a time when we were driving. I think we were in Montana at that point, and I was looking at the scenery, just enjoying it, thinking, man, this is awesome. Look around us. And he looks at me and he holds my hand and he says, I wish I could just be happy with you, but I'm not. And it's not you. And it just crushed me. He kept telling me he wanted to see what the next life was like. He was hurting. He'd always be talking or motioning as though he was shooting himself in the head, talking about how he wanted to die, talking about how tired he was. And I just kept trying to bring him back from that. No, Robbie, you're better than that. Robbie, you have so much to live for. I took it personally, like I wasn't enough for him to be happy with. One day, he looked at me, and again he said, Lindsay, I'm tired. I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to die. So I said, I know of a way to do it that won't hurt. You'll just go unconscious, and then you just won't wake up. And he looked at me, and his eyes sparkled, and he said, you would do that for me? And I said, Robbie, I love you. I would do anything for you. And he said, okay. And that floored me, and I broke down, and I cried so hard. And so he said, no. He hated to see me sad. He hated to see me cry. And so he held me, and he said, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Don't be sad. Please don't be sad. And he just held me, and we slept that night. And the next morning I woke up and I said, I'm sorry I couldn't do that last night. I didn't expect you to be so ready. And he said, I couldn't have expected you to do that for me. And there again, my heart broke. I expected him to say, no, we were just drunk. I didn't mean it. Or, I'm glad you didn't because, today's nice or something. But no, he said, I couldn't have expected that from you. And so I just felt like I let him down again. When we got to Billings, we sat in the parking lot at Walmart. We had wine to drink and enjoyed the sun. And we got back in the truck, and he motioned again, that he was shooting himself in the head. And I just felt like I was letting him down again. Like I thought we were having a nice day, but now here he is again, just wanting to die. And I asked, is that really what you want? And he said, yes. And I said, are you sure? And he said, yes. So I said, okay. And I sat on the center console, and I said, come here. And he came to me, and I put my arms around his neck, and then he just bowed his head.
I started, I didn't feel like I could really do it. I squeezed, and I could tell it wasn't hard enough. And so I put my other arm behind his neck and squeezed until he was unconscious. And he shook, and I thought maybe he was waking up and he was gonna stop me. But then he stopped shaking. And I knew I had to go. And so I buckled him in, and I went to drive out of the parking lot, and I realized I had no idea where I was. And I looked, I looked to Robbie because he always knew where to go. And I said, baby, where do I go? And he looked like he was sleeping. And I started to think about how I could get him back. And I pulled into traffic and crossed lanes and got into a parking lot, and I unbuckled his seatbelt and I put him on the center console, and I started doing CPR, and I breathed into him, and I could hear like air was going in, like something was happening. I begged him, Robbie, please wake up, please wake up. And then I heard a knock on the window, and somebody said, excuse me. And there was a police officer. I just told him I killed him. Please bring him back.
This was a good time. There's Robbie. My name is Dory Grayson, and I was born and raised in Tampa, Florida. I love this one. Robbie was my son. I met my first husband, Bob Mast, when I was 24. We had our first son, Benjamin, and then we had our second son, Robbie, in 1990. Robbie was fun. He was outgoing. Of course, I loved him very much, and he was so precious.
Well, my name is Gene, and I actually became part of this family in May of 1996. I got to be Ben and Robbie's stepfather about, I guess, 12 years or so before they left home. And I thought we had a good 12 years.
I didn't know when I was going to see him again, and I had no idea where he was going. And Gene and I were sitting on the road, and I just collapsed in Gene's arms because I thought, where's he going? What's he going to do? It was a year and 24 days before we heard from him.
The reason we didn't hear from him very often was because he knew that his lifestyle would be painful to us, especially if he called us when he was drinking. We'd be able to tell. and he knew that'd make us sad.
You know, there was just so much we didn't know.
In May, he took himself into an alcohol rehab, got to talk to his supervisors. Everybody said he was doing so well, and so we thought we would hear when he got out, and we never heard from him again. Next thing we heard was, 4 months later, he was dead.
It was September the 17th. When the phone rang, she just told me that Robbie was dead, just like that. Of course I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. What? I just yelled and yelled. I yelled for Robbie, Robbie, come back, Robbie, come back. As if he could hear me and he would come back. Just, Robbie, come back. And when I learned he'd been murdered, I was upset that somebody would kill Robbie. Because he was a nice guy. He was a good guy. He was just a hurting guy. And I thought maybe someone just killed him because they didn't think he was worth anything. And I hated that. Then I read about it and I saw that it was this woman and the paper says she was his girlfriend. And I was like, no, no, no. Who is this woman? And why would she kill Robbie?
It's not every day that here in Billings we have a female accused of such a horrendous crime. And not only that, but one that would use their own hands to commit that crime. My name's Steve Hallam. I've been with the Billings Police Department here in Montana for roughly 14 years.
When I had Lindsay step into the interview room, obviously I kind of had an idea of how Robbie lost his life, and it was just to figure out what happened and why it happened.
And when did you start asking me to end his life for him?
Probably about a week ago.
How'd that conversation come up?
We drank a lot of wine, and we were drunk, and he was just like, I'm not happy here. I'm really not. I just want to die. I just want to go away. And I was like, well, look, I am a big, strong girl, and I can take you out, and it won't hurt. I promise you. And if that's what you really want, I love you enough to give that to you.
Very rarely, if ever, have I ever heard up until this case somebody asking somebody else to kill them. I've been doing this job for a long time. If somebody wants to end their life, there are plenty of other ways to do it.
So let's go back to this morning. What are you guys talking about when you're laying on the ground in the parking lot behind your shop?
Nothing at all. We were talking about getting more booze.
Yeah, just shooting the shit, huh?
Yeah, no, just hanging out and making sure.
So according to Lindsay's testimony up to this point in time, they're intoxicated, talking about how good things are, and now a couple minutes later we're inside the Tahoe, and now all of a sudden she's saying that Robbie's telling her that he's not happy, he wants to die, and he wants her to kill him. It just, again, didn't make sense.
Show me what you did.
I put him in a rear naked choke like this.
Okay.
Until he started seizing a little bit, and then he passed out, and I was like, all right. And then once he was out, I got in front of him and grabbed his nose and his mouth and kept his chin shut.
Okay.
And he foamed at the mouth a little bit. I kept thinking he was dead, and I let him go, and he fucking seized him. I'm like, Robbie, do you really fucking want me to do this? Because I don't want to. And he just kept putting my hand back. And I was like, okay, they're fine.
That right there is an absolute lie. If you listen to the video real carefully, she states that he kept grabbing her hand and putting the hand back on his mouth. Well, if you're unconscious, you're not going to have that ability to grab somebody and put their hand back on your mouth. There's no way that could have happened. Every act that she's committing on him now is at her own hand. That's it, period.
What were you planning on doing with Robbie's body?
I was having a hard time with that. I mean, I was having a hard time with the whole fucking thing, but I was just figuring I'd find a scarcely populated area and fucking dump him. I mean...
So after she took the life from Robbie, she was going to find a place to bury him, drop him off, and it seems like a total inconvenience from her based on her testimony. And then she's going to go back to Washington and act like she never even knew Robbie. So that goes to show you just how much she loved Robbie. She didn't love Robbie. If she would have loved Robbie, she would have never done this act.
Even if he begged you to do that, why did you do that?
We're at the point where the interview has now turned from an interview into an interrogation, and I was pretty stunned and shocked what came out of her mouth next.
Lindsay, here's the deal. I've been doing this shit for a while, okay? I buy how it happened. I buy you guys were traveling. I don't buy that he was unhappy and he begged.
No, that's absolutely what happened. That's absolutely what happened. But yes, I kind of just wanted to kill somebody with my bare hands, honestly.
Well, then that makes more sense to me.
That right there was stunning, shocking. I've never had anybody say that to me in an interview room before.
So you just wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody with your bare hands?
Kind of, but no, it was also that he asked.
Hang on, like... one thing at a time, my dear.
You're making me out to be the bad guy.
I'm not. Listen, have I ever called you bad?
No.
Are you in handcuffs right now?
No.
Do I have like 5 guys next to me because I'm scared shitless?
Well, you should be. I'm just kidding. No.
You know what I'm saying?
I know.
All right, so you just came out and you told me you just kind of wanted to feel what it would feel like to kill somebody with your bare hands. What made you think like that? Was it past experiences or what?
Well, my last fiance, he broke my hand like this, and then he got behind me just like I did to Robbie and fucking choked me out. And I remember waking up on the floor and like it was like I was underwater, but I wasn't, and I knew he was like he was smothering me, and I guess I just wanted to do that back, but not to someone so sweet like Robbie. He just wanted it to happen, so I just saw my opportunity, I guess. Okay.
I saw the opportunity. That's the whole case there. Perfect opportunity. You can't fight back. We're in an unknown location. Nobody knows us. I'm ready and willing. Let's get it done. I want to take somebody's life. From her own words, you can't contest this video and what Lindsay says in her own words. I think Lindsay tries to paint a picture of herself to kind of minimize who she really truly is. She is a deliberate homicidal killer.
Let's see what we got here. So there's the 7 o'clock call, which is 9 o'clock.
Does it say 7? Or?
Yeah, right there, 7.
Okay, got it.
So that's for 9 o'clock our time.
Oh, because we're going to do 2.
Yeah, we do 2 calls in a row. Dory and I have been ministering in prisons for at least 14 years, and most of them that we have met are not the same person they were before they went to prison. So we have compassion for those people who have lost their freedom due to their own stupidity and own bad choices.
Okay, let's be quiet because you can come on. Hi.
Hi. Oh, you did good.
So did you leave early?
No, we all left at the same time, but there was somebody on the phone, so I
Oh,
had to kick them
good.
off.
So you didn't miss anything?
No.
I'm going to have to write you up, though, Lindsay. You were 50 seconds late. Oh, me.
Yeah, you need to work on that.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you're doing so good, I know.
Well, actually, honestly, Friday when Dory had a hard time getting on the computer, I was like 30 seconds late.
And I didn't
Oh, you
know.
were? You're admitting that now, huh? Yeah.
So tell us about it. How was your
It
weekend?
was amazing. It's the newest girl in choir. I'm just really enjoying it.
I was able to forgive Lindsay because I know I am forgiven by God.
It was okay if we sang a song together.
To hang on to things can bring so much resentment inside of us that it can destroy us.
Cheering and then...
How about you singing it for us now? Can you do that?
Oh, okay.
It's been a while since I've heard it.
How many times have I felt ashamed to see my wrongs again call my name? If you take the time to listen, you'd hear the same. Your sins are forgiven and you are called not guilty.
Amen. Thank you, Lindsay. We love hearing you sing, and let's say our goodbyes. We love you.
Call us anytime. Bye.
I think it's important to get the message out about forgiveness, both receiving it and giving it. In the beginning, I think our forgiveness was real. I think what we didn't have and what you see now is we didn't have a love for Lindsay. I mean, how could you? You know, as I said in my first letter, I usually begin my letters with, "Dear Lindsay," but I certainly do not consider you dear given what you've done. But then it wasn't long in the letters going back and forth, but I could say, "Dear Lindsay."
I did not expect this to go this far. And I felt, you know, okay, this precious human being is sorry. She's got to pay for this in prison. But the letters just kept going to now.
I wish you all could have been there when Dory met Lindsay. We're in a room, a visiting park. They cleared it all out just for us. So Lindsay walks in. We hear her steps coming down the hall. The door opens. She walks in, walking towards Dory. Dory walking to her, and Lindsay says, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And Dory says, "I forgive you. Lindsay, I forgive you. I love you." And they hug. It was just precious. And Dory knew then her forgiveness was real, her love was real.
Of course, I gotta say, Lindsay has brought me a lot of joy in how she's responded. You know, the person who took my son's life, her just saying, you know, "I'm so sorry," and receiving our forgiveness. She's been an example of how I need to be with my Savior, the one who's forgiven me.
Right here.
So you spent Friday afternoon in Missoula with Robert Mast, and the girl he was with, Lindsay.
It was pretty intense. We both definitely had been drinking. Like, she was really, really about him. I was like, I'm in love with Robbie. I really care about him. I really like him. But they hadn't really known each other that long.
You know somebody for 4 weeks, and now you just out of the blue say, you know what? I've known you for 4 weeks. You seem like a great gal. I don't want to live anymore. Would you mind killing me? No way. It did not happen like that.
He was talking about his ex a lot, Kate, who's a mutual friend of ours. And that seemed to really piss her off. They were together for years and had something really strong, even though they spent time apart. That's kind of what he was saying. That he missed Kate, you know? It was apparent. He kept talking about her. And Lindsay seemed pretty annoyed with that.
Why do you think Robbie was with this Lindsay gal?
I don't know. She had a vehicle. It's a ride. And they were talking about going up to the Northeast, and I know that's the area Kate was in too. Maybe he kind of had ulterior motives, and maybe she was figuring that out.
That jealousy deep inside her, knowing that she loved Robbie way more than Robbie loved her, if he even did at all. And he was using her to get back to the love of his life, Kate. I think that was kind of fuel on a fire. And it was a perfect storm up there in the Walmart parking lot in Billings, Montana.
When others would say to me, I would never be able to forgive someone who killed my child, I felt they were saying it like I was betraying him. And I do understand people who have a hard time forgiving, or even those who haven't forgiven Lindsay.
We are confident as we could be about anything in life that what Robbie would want us to do is to forgive Lindsay. You know, I know there's some who doubt whether Lindsay is being totally honest, and I don't have any problem accepting Lindsay's story. The bottom line is, let's say that it was premeditated and with malice and so forth. I still believe our place is to forgive her.
She should have taken him to a hospital, and he should have gotten the help that he needed. I know it, Jean knows it, she knows it. She's expressed that to us. But I don't make any excuses for what she did. I just know that redemption is real.
We believe that who Lindsay is becoming, the life that Lindsay is living, helps to give Robbie's life purpose. And in saying that, I guess you'd say, helps to give Robbie's death purpose.
People hear this story and they think that Dory is maybe damaging her son's memory or disrespecting his memory by being friends with me. And I understand where they're coming from. I know it's a hard thing to grasp.
But I can't help think that Robbie would have wanted it this way. I guess my relationship with Dorian Jean could be seen as beneficial to my parole, but that is not something that I'm concerned with. Do I hope I get out someday? Yeah, absolutely. But I believe that God has me here for a reason. And if He wants me to stay here for all 60 years, then I'll stay here. I don't know that Robbie felt as strongly as I did about me as I felt about him. I had barely met him. We talked a lot and we were very close, but I didn't even know what his mom was like or that he had a stepdad. When I first started hanging out with Robbie, he was talking about going to the beet harvest and getting back with Kate. And we met some of Robbie's friends along the way in Missoula just a few days before his murder. And they all spoke very fondly of Kate. And it was something that made me jealous. It made me feel very hurt, very insignificant. And it was something that Robbie and I actually had a fight about. And so we did have that talk. We did have that fight. It doesn't surprise me at all that people think that he was still going to meet Kate, because that was probably the last anyone heard of him. But he expressed that he wanted to stay with me. And I believed him. I still believe that he meant it. So just listen to it.
I buy how it happened. I buy you guys were traveling. I don't buy that he was unhappy and he begged.
No, that's absolutely what happened. That's absolutely what happened. But yes, I kind of just wanted to kill somebody with my bare hands, honestly.
Well, then that makes more sense to me.
I haven't heard that clip in a long time. I'm shocked by it. I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. And I'm sorry that my attitude was so flippant. It's appalling. I said I just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone with my bare hands, because I was getting called a liar again. And in the relationship before Robbie, I was being called a liar all the time when I was being honest. And I found that the easiest way to stop being called a liar is to tell the person calling me a liar what it was that they wanted to hear. For anyone who thinks that that was something that I had looked for or planned for or wanted to do, I don't know that there's anything I can do to change your mind, but it's not true. I've never wanted to kill anybody. Once you've killed somebody, you can't just feel normal. I'm afraid to give somebody a hug. You know, people look at my hands like, are they dirty? Is there something wrong with them? Because I kind of feel like there are sometimes. The only way I think that I can really show how sorry I am is to live a different life and be the best person I can be for Robbie and for all the people that I hurt by taking him. If I can make a difference, if I can do something good with my life, it's like Robbie is living on through me. It's like Robbie's life still has meaning. That might never be enough, but it's all I can give. And that's what I intend to do, and that's what I do every day.
For more than 4 decades, there was no face to blame, no confession to silence the questions, and no courtroom to explain why 2 young lives ended on opposite sides of the Pacific Northwest. There were only miles of evergreen forest, lonely highways disappearing into heavy rain, abandoned evidence scattered across 2 American states, and families forced to measure time not by birthdays or holidays, but by another year without answers. It became one of those cases investigators never truly left behind, the kind that sat in filing cabinets while detectives retired, laboratories changed, and entire generations grew up, without realizing that somewhere, hidden inside a tiny fragment of biological evidence collected in 1987, the identity of a killer had been waiting patiently for science to catch up. Long before the words genetic genealogy entered everyday conversation, before DNA databases became powerful investigative tools, before cold cases around the world began collapsing under the weight of modern forensic technology, there was simply an unanswered mystery stretching across the border between Canada and the United States. The names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg slowly became symbols of everything investigators feared most: a crime committed by a stranger, with no obvious motive, almost no eyewitnesses, and a trail that seemed to vanish into the forests of Washington state. In November 1987, Jay Cook was 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18. They were young, optimistic, and looking toward the future with the confidence shared by countless couples who believe ordinary days will continue forever. They lived in British Columbia, Canada, surrounded by family and friends who knew them as hardworking, responsible, and deeply devoted to one another. There was nothing remarkable about the trip they planned. Nothing suggested it would become one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting unsolved murder investigations. Their journey had a practical purpose. They intended to travel south into Washington state, deliver furnace parts to acquaintances, and return home. It was not supposed to be dangerous. It was not supposed to attract attention. It was simply another drive across an international border that thousands of Canadians completed every week. The Pacific Northwest has always possessed 2 identities. During daylight, towering evergreens, coastal mountains, and quiet roads create breathtaking landscapes admired by travelers from around the world. Yet when darkness settles over isolated highways and dense forests, those same places become vast, silent corridors where almost anything can happen without a witness. In 1987, surveillance cameras were rare outside banks and major businesses. Mobile phones were virtually non-existent. GPS tracking belonged to science fiction. Once a vehicle disappeared beyond the view of family or friends, finding it depended almost entirely on chance. That reality shaped every missing person investigation of the era. Every hour that passed without contact widened the search area exponentially. Every mile driven became another unknown. Jay and Tanya crossed into the United States carrying ordinary expectations. Their families expected them home soon. No emergency calls arrived. No warnings reached relatives waiting in Canada. Somewhere during that routine journey, something changed forever. The exact sequence of events has remained one of the most difficult questions in the entire investigation. Detectives would later spend decades reconstructing timelines, comparing witness statements, reviewing maps, and analyzing every known movement. But the first critical moments after the couple encountered their killer remain impossible to observe directly. There were no cameras recording their final conversations. No electronic transactions capable of tracking every stop. Only scattered evidence discovered days later, separated by distance and time. When loved ones realized Jay and Tanya had failed to return, concern quickly replaced confidence. Missing adults often reappear after vehicle problems or unexpected delays, investigators knew. But something about this disappearance felt different almost immediately. The couple had dependable plans. They had responsibilities waiting at home. They had no known reason to vanish voluntarily. As hours turned into days, every unanswered phone call carried growing dread. Families began asking questions no parent or sibling ever wants to ask. Where were they? Had they crashed somewhere in the wilderness? Had someone offered assistance after mechanical trouble? Or had they crossed paths with the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment? The first discoveries offered no comfort. Instead, they transformed anxiety into horror. Tanya's body was found in rural Skagit County, Washington. She had been killed far from home, her remains left in an isolated area where the surrounding landscape swallowed sound and concealed evidence beneath thick vegetation. Investigators immediately recognized they were facing a homicide. Every detail demanded careful preservation. Crime scene technicians photographed the location meticulously, documenting positions, terrain, weather conditions, and any object capable of revealing what had happened. The challenge confronting them was immense. Outdoor crime scenes deteriorate rapidly. Rain washes away impressions. Wine scatters lightweight materials. Animals disturb evidence. Every passing hour threatens the integrity of forensic findings. The discovery raised immediate questions that only multiplied with further investigation. Where was Jay? If Tanya had been murdered, what had happened to him? Was he alive somewhere, injured, or imprisoned? Had he escaped? Was another crime scene waiting to be discovered? Detectives could not assume both victims had suffered identical fates. Their search expanded urgently across counties, highways, and wooded terrain. Law enforcement agencies coordinated resources despite jurisdictional boundaries, recognizing that whoever had attacked the young Canadian couple might still be traveling freely through the region. Then came another devastating discovery. Jay Cook's body was found separately in Snohomish County, many miles away from where Tanya had been located. The geographical separation immediately complicated the investigation. Detectives now faced not one crime scene, but multiple locations connected by an unknown sequence of events. Every mile between those sites represented uncertainty. Had the victims been transported together? Had they been separated shortly after the initial encounter? Did the killer possess detailed knowledge of rural Washington roads, or were the disposal locations selected randomly? Mapping those movements became one of the central challenges investigators would revisit repeatedly over the following decades. Crime scene specialists worked with the forensic capabilities available in the late 1980s. They collected fingerprints wherever possible. They documented fibers, biological material, clothing, personal possessions, and ballistic evidence. Firearms examinations became especially important after investigators determined Jay had been fatally shot. Tanya's murder involved different forms of violence, forcing detectives to consider offender behavior carefully. The differences suggested control, opportunity, and decisions made over an extended period rather than a spontaneous confrontation ending in immediate death. Behavioral analysts examined the available evidence cautiously, aware that conclusions unsupported by physical findings could misdirect an already difficult investigation. The abandoned van used by the couple eventually became another crucial piece of evidence. Located away from both murder scenes, it represented yet another puzzle in an investigation already fragmented across multiple counties. Vehicles often preserve valuable forensic traces. Latent fingerprints, hairs, fibers, blood, biological residues, and impressions may survive even after considerable use. Technicians processed the van methodically using the best procedures available at the time. Every surface was examined. Every recoverable trace was cataloged. Among the materials preserved during that painstaking work was biological evidence whose full significance would remain hidden for decades. Investigators could not yet know that advances in forensic genetics would eventually transform that carefully stored sample into the breakthrough the case desperately needed. At the time, however, such hope did not exist. DNA profiling itself was still emerging as an investigative technique. The revolutionary power it would eventually hold remained largely unrealized. Detectives relied heavily on witness interviews, traditional forensic comparisons, neighborhood canvasses, and public appeals. They reconstructed travel routes, attempting to identify anyone who might have encountered Jay and Tanya during their journey south. Gas stations, convenience stores, restaurants, repair shops, border crossings, and roadside businesses all became potential sources of information. Every receipt mattered. Every reported sighting required verification. Every anonymous tip demanded attention, regardless of how improbable it initially appeared. Witness memories, however, fade quickly. Passing encounters on highways rarely remain vivid unless something extraordinary occurs. Many people unknowingly crossed paths with the victims or perhaps even their killer without realizing they would later become part of a homicide investigation. Detectives appealed repeatedly for anyone recalling suspicious individuals, unfamiliar vehicles, or unusual roadside incidents during those November days. Some tips appeared promising before collapsing under scrutiny. Others introduced contradictory timelines. Each required precious investigative resources. Such is the reality of complex homicide inquiries. Thousands of leads often produce little more than dead ends. Meanwhile, grief settled permanently over to Canadian families. The international nature of the investigation added emotional and logistical complications. Loved ones mourned while depending upon another country's law enforcement agencies for answers. Press coverage spread throughout British Columbia and Washington state, generating public concern and increasing pressure on investigators. Communities on both sides of the border followed developments closely, hoping an arrest would come quickly. Instead, weeks passed without resolution. Months became years. The murders refused to fade quietly. Detectives recognized characteristics consistent with an offender capable of targeting strangers, committing extreme violence, and disappearing without immediate detection. Such offenders often inspire widespread fear because they seem disconnected from the victim's personal relationships. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and family members usually become the first focus of homicide investigations because statistically, they are most likely to know the victim. Stranger homicides present entirely different difficulties. Without an existing relationship connecting victim and offender, investigators must search outward into an almost limitless population. As the investigation matured, evidence accumulated without producing certainty. Files expanded, interviews multiplied, maps filled with annotations. Laboratory reports joined witness statements inside increasingly crowded case folders. Detectives debated theories carefully while remaining anchored to verified facts. Did robbery initiate the encounter? Was the couple selected randomly? Did the offender operate alone? Had similar crimes occurred elsewhere? Every possibility remained open because conclusive evidence favored none of them. Somewhere beyond those unanswered questions, the person responsible continued living an ordinary life, shielded not by innocence, but by anonymity. Years slowly transformed the murders into what investigators reluctantly call a cold case, though nothing about the pain experienced by the victims' families ever became cold. The label merely reflected investigative reality. Active leads diminished. New evidence stopped appearing. Personnel changed. Yet the preserved exhibits collected in 1987 remain secured inside evidence storage, silent witnesses waiting for scientific advances nobody could fully imagine. Long before anyone spoke about genealogy websites, family trees built from DNA, or distant relatives unknowingly pointing investigators toward hidden suspects, those sealed packages continued existing exactly as technicians had left them, untouched by time but filled with possibilities that would not reveal themselves until decades later, while the names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg continued echoing through every discussion of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting unsolved murders. Their story refusing to disappear even as the trail itself seemed to vanish into 41 years of silence. The investigation accelerated with the urgency expected whenever two young victims are found murdered within days of crossing an international border. But urgency alone could not overcome the absence of a clear suspect. Detectives from multiple agencies assembled timelines that stretched across Washington state, laying maps across conference tables and marking every confirmed location connected to Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Every highway interchange, every service station, every reported sighting, and every abandoned piece of evidence became another point in an expanding puzzle. The challenge was not a lack of information, but the inability to determine which fragments truly belonged together. Somewhere between the Canadian border and the wooded roads of Skagit and Snohomish counties, an ordinary trip had transformed into a carefully concealed double homicide. The question consuming investigators was brutally simple. Where had the couple first encountered the person responsible? Border crossing records established that Jay and Tanya had entered the United States as planned. Friends and relatives confirmed they had left home with routine expectations and no indication that they feared anyone or intended to disappear. Investigators reconstructed the purpose of the journey with remarkable precision. The couple had been delivering furnace parts to acquaintances in Washington before returning to British Columbia. It was an errand, not an adventure. There were no known disputes, no hidden relationships, and no evidence suggesting they had arranged to meet a stranger. That ordinary purpose became significant because it narrowed the possibilities. Detectives increasingly believed the violence had not originated from someone already known to the victims, but from an unexpected encounter during the trip itself. Every location the couple was believed to have visited received attention. Employees were interviewed. Customers were identified where possible. Cash register receipts, handwritten delivery records, and telephone logs were examined. In an era before digital surveillance and electronic payment records became commonplace, investigators depended heavily on memory. They asked countless witnesses the same questions repeatedly. Did you notice a young Canadian couple? Did you see anyone following them? Was there an unfamiliar vehicle parked nearby? Did anything unusual happen that day? Most answers ended with uncertainty. Faces blurred together after days and weeks. Travelers passed through without leaving names. Ordinary moments disappeared into routine long before anyone realized a murder investigation would depend upon them. As detectives traced the victim's final known movements, another disturbing possibility emerged. Evidence suggested that the couple may have been separated before both murders had occurred. That realization dramatically altered investigative thinking. Rather than a single explosion of violence ending in immediate death, the offender may have maintained control over one or both victims for a period of time. Such behavior implied planning, confidence, and a willingness to move victims between multiple locations without attracting attention. Behavioral specialists avoided sensational conclusions, but they recognized that transporting victims over significant distances increased both risk and opportunity. Every additional mile offered another chance for the offender to be seen, yet somehow those opportunities had not resulted in an identifiable witness. The locations where Jay and Tanya were ultimately discovered deepened the mystery. Tanya's body was recovered in a remote area of Skagit County, while Jay's body was found many miles away in Snohomish County. The separation forced investigators to consider the geography carefully. Rural Washington contains dense forests, winding secondary roads, logging routes, and isolated clearings capable of concealing criminal activity from passing motorists. An offender familiar with the region would understand where traffic was sparse and where discovery might be delayed. Detectives compared maps with topographical surveys, evaluating whether the disposal sites reflected local knowledge or random selection. There was no definitive answer, but experienced investigators suspected the killer had moved through the region with confidence rather than hesitation. Forensic teams processed every available scene using the best scientific methods of the late 1980s. Photographs documented terrain before evidence was disturbed. Soil samples were collected. Tire impressions were measured wherever conditions permitted. Footwear marks were examined, though weather and natural exposure had degraded many impressions before investigators arrived. Every recovered object was carefully packaged to prevent contamination. The importance of preserving biological evidence was already understood, even though forensic DNA technology remained in its infancy. Detectives could not predict precisely how science would evolve, but they recognized that future laboratory techniques might reveal information impossible to obtain in 1987. Attention soon turned toward the van the couple had been driving. Recovered apart from both murder scenes, it represented a mobile crime scene with the potential to reveal crucial interactions between victims and offender. Investigators searched every interior surface for latent fingerprints, fibers, hairs, blood, and trace materials. Doors, steering wheel, handles, seats, cargo compartments, and personal belongings were systematically examined. Items found inside were photographed in place before removal. Evidence technicians understood that the smallest overlooked detail could later become the most significant discovery. One particularly important finding involved biological evidence preserved from inside the vehicle. Although laboratories at the time lacked the sophisticated analytical capabilities that would emerge decades later, technicians followed proper collection procedures, ensuring the material remained suitable for future examination. That decision would eventually become one of the investigation's defining moments. Yet in 1987, it was simply another carefully labeled exhibit placed into secure storage alongside hundreds of photographs, reports, diagrams, and witness statements. No detective present could know that this seemingly ordinary act of evidence preservation would one day identify a killer after 41 years of silence. Investigators also studied the victim's personal property. Missing items raised questions about robbery, while recovered belongings complicated theories regarding motive. Criminal investigators have long understood that offenders sometimes steal property to profit, sometimes to eliminate evidence, and sometimes for reasons having little financial significance. Determining which explanation applied required careful comparison of everything known to have accompanied Jay and Tanya when they left Canada. Friends and relatives assisted by describing clothing, luggage, documents, and everyday possessions. Every discrepancy became another line in the investigative file. Ballistics experts examined the firearm evidence connected to Jay's death. Microscopic analysis of bullets and cartridge cases sought characteristics capable of identifying the weapon used. Such examinations often determine caliber, rifling patterns, and manufacturing marks that may later connect crimes involving the same firearm. The detectives entered the available information into investigative records, hoping future comparisons might establish links to other violent offenses. No immediate connection emerged. The weapon itself remained missing, depriving investigators of one of the most direct forms of forensic comparison available in homicide cases. Public interest continued growing as newspapers in both Canada and the United States reported each new development. Headlines described the young couple, the unusual cross-border investigation, and the absence of a suspect. Community members expressed fear that an unidentified murderer had targeted strangers traveling through the Pacific Northwest. As detectives encouraged the public to remain vigilant without creating unnecessary panic, they emphasized that even seemingly insignificant observations could become valuable if reported promptly. Anonymous tip lines received calls from concerned citizens, but separating genuine information from rumor proved increasingly difficult as media coverage expanded. Each promising lead generated fresh optimism before collapsing under closer examination. Individuals reported suspicious vehicles that could not be verified. Others believed they had seen the couple after investigators knew they were already dead. Several names surfaced repeatedly through public speculation, yet none could be connected to the physical evidence. Detectives followed procedure rather than public pressure, eliminating possibilities one by one through interviews, alibi verification, forensic comparison, and factual analysis. The process was painstaking, often frustrating, and rarely visible to the families waiting desperately for answers. As weeks became months, investigators confronted one of the harshest realities in criminal investigation. Time almost always favors the offender. Witness memories fade. Physical evidence deteriorates despite careful preservation. Potential suspects relocate, change jobs, or alter appearances. Records disappear. Businesses close. Vehicles are sold or destroyed. Every passing day increases the difficulty of reconstructing events with certainty. Yet despite those obstacles, the investigative team refused to classify the murders as unsolvable. They believed the answer existed somewhere within the evidence already collected. They simply lacked the scientific tools necessary to reveal it. By the beginning of 1988, the investigation had expanded far beyond the wooded roads where Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were found. Detectives were no longer searching only for a killer. They were attempting to reconstruct an invisible chain of events that stretched across dozens of miles and several jurisdictions, a chain with missing links at nearly every stage. Every confirmed fact seemed surrounded by unanswered questions. They knew where the journey had begun. They knew where the victims had been discovered. What remained hidden was everything that happened in between, and it was within those missing hours that the identity of the offender remained concealed. Investigators revisited the victim's intended route repeatedly. Maps were covered with colored markings representing confirmed locations, estimated travel times, possible detours, and areas where the couple might have stopped. Detectives drove the same highways at different times of day, measuring distances and calculating how long it would have taken to travel from one point to another under normal traffic conditions. They examined intersections where strangers could have initiated contact, isolated stretches where a disabled vehicle might have appeared vulnerable, and commercial areas where witnesses may have unknowingly seen the victims alongside their future killer. Every mile was treated as potential evidence. The working theory increasingly suggested that Jay and Tanya had encountered someone they had never met before. There was no evidence of long-standing disputes, organized criminal involvement, or personal enemies capable of explaining such violence. Their families described them as responsible, dependable young people with plans for the future. Friends spoke of ordinary ambitions rather than dangerous lifestyles. Investigators therefore devoted considerable attention to the possibility of an opportunistic offender, someone whose victims were selected because circumstances unexpectedly created an opportunity rather than because they were specifically targeted. That possibility made the investigation extraordinarily difficult. Crimes involving strangers remove one of the strongest advantages available to homicide detectives: the victim's social circle. In many murder investigations, detectives begin with family members, close friends, company workers, or acquaintances because statistics consistently show that victims often know the person responsible. In this case, that approach produced no breakthrough. Interviews with relatives, employers, neighbors, and friends established timelines and confirmed the couple's character, but none revealed a credible suspect connected to the crime scenes. Law enforcement agencies throughout Washington state received detailed bulletins describing the investigation. Detectives compared the circumstances surrounding Jay and Tanya's murders with reports of kidnappings, sexual assaults, robberies, and homicides involving similar methods. They searched for patterns that might indicate a serial offender operating across the Pacific Northwest. Behavioral similarities occasionally appeared promising, but closer examination usually revealed critical differences. Different victim profiles, different weapons, Different forensic evidence or incompatible timelines prevented investigators from confidently linking the crimes. The murders remained disturbingly isolated. One of the most important tasks involved identifying every person known to have interacted with the victims during their trip. Detectives traced deliveries, telephone contacts, and reported conversations from the days before the murders. They interviewed acquaintances in both Canada and the United States, confirming the purpose of the journey and verifying the expected schedule. Every individual connected to the planned deliveries cooperated with investigators, and none emerged as a viable suspect. The ordinary nature of the trip only deepened the mystery. There had been no secret meeting, no unexplained deviation, and no known conflict capable of explaining the violence that followed. Meanwhile, forensic laboratories continued examining evidence collected from the various crime scenes. Specialists analyzed clothing for trace materials, searching for fibers, hairs, pollen, paint fragments, or microscopic debris that could connect the victims to another location or another individual. Soil comparisons were conducted where appropriate, although the outdoor environments complicated interpretation. Exposure to weather, vegetation, and natural contamination limited what could be concluded with confidence. Even so, investigators preserved every sample because advances in forensic science had already begun transforming criminal investigations during the 1980s. Experienced detectives understood that evidence dismissed today might become decisive tomorrow. The biological evidence recovered during the investigation remained particularly significant. At the time, DNA profiling was only beginning to emerge as a practical forensic technique. Laboratories capable of performing sophisticated DNA analysis were limited, and the technology itself required relatively large, well-preserved samples compared with modern standards. Detectives recognized the potential value of the evidence, but also understood that existing scientific capabilities imposed serious limitations. Samples were carefully preserved according to established procedures, ensuring they would remain available if improved testing methods became possible in the future. The investigation generated thousands of pages of documentation. Witness interviews filled cabinets. Photographs documented every relevant location. Hand-drawn diagrams illustrated crime scenes and evidence placement. Detectives maintained chronological logs recording investigative decisions, follow-up interviews, laboratory requests, and incoming tips. Such documentation served a vital purpose. Complex homicide investigations often extend for years, requiring new investigators to understand decisions made long before they joined the case. Thorough records preserve institutional memory when personnel inevitably change. Public response remained intense throughout British Columbia and Washington state. Newspapers regularly published updates, often emphasizing the absence of an identified suspect. Community members expressed sympathy for the victims' families while also confronting an uncomfortable reality. If a stranger had committed these murders without leaving investigators enough evidence for an arrest, then that individual might still represent a danger to others. Detectives carefully balanced transparency with caution, releasing information capable of generating useful leads while withholding specific forensic details known only to investigators and the offender. Protecting those details ensured future confessions or witness statements could be tested for authenticity. Tips continued arriving from the public, sometimes in overwhelming numbers. Every telephone call required documentation. Every named individual required evaluation. Detectives interviewed people reported by acquaintances, former partners, anonymous callers, and concerned citizens. Many tips reflected genuine attempts to help. Others were based on rumor, misunderstanding, or coincidence. A suspicious vehicle seen near one crime scene might ultimately prove unrelated after registration records and interviews established innocent explanations. Nevertheless, investigators understood that solving stranger homicides sometimes depends upon one overlooked observation hidden among hundreds of inaccurate reports. No lead could be dismissed without careful examination. As months passed, investigative momentum gradually slowed despite the continued commitment of law enforcement. This pattern is common in major homicide investigations. The earliest phase typically produces the greatest volume of information as witnesses are identified and evidence is collected. Later stages increasingly depend upon forensic analysis, renewed interviews, and the discovery of previously unknown connections. In the J. Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg investigation, those connections remained frustratingly elusive. Detectives had assembled an enormous amount of information, yet none of it crossed the critical threshold required to identify a suspect beyond reasonable doubt. Families on both sides of the border faced a different kind of struggle. Public attention gradually diminished as newer headlines replaced older tragedies. Investigators remained committed, but media coverage became less frequent, and the daily urgency experienced during the first weeks inevitably faded. For the relatives of Jay and Tanya, however, nothing faded. Every unanswered anniversary reinforced the same painful reality. Someone knew exactly what had happened during those missing hours in November 1987. And that person continued living freely while two families carried unanswered questions into every passing year. By the end of the investigation's first year, detectives had eliminated numerous possibilities without identifying the one that mattered most. The physical evidence remained preserved. Witness statements remained organized. The investigative file continued expanding even as active leads became increasingly rare. No one could predict that the most significant breakthrough would not arrive through a confession, a forgotten witness, or a chance arrest. Instead, the answer would remain hidden inside biological evidence already sitting quietly in secure storage, waiting for forensic science to evolve beyond anything investigators in 1988 could reasonably imagine. The investigation entered the 1990s carrying both determination and frustration. Detectives had exhausted the most obvious investigative avenues, yet the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg refused to yield a suspect. The case remained active, but its character had changed. Instead of daily searches, emergency interviews, and rapidly developing evidence, the investigation became a long campaign of persistence. Every new detective assigned to the file inherited not only thousands of pages of reports, but also the responsibility of questioning assumptions made years earlier. Cold cases are rarely solved by simply waiting. They survive because investigators continue asking whether something important was overlooked the first time. The case files filled shelves. Boxes contained photographs of remote logging roads, evidence inventories, witness statements, laboratory reports, hand-drawn maps, and correspondence between agencies in Canada and the United States. Every document represented another attempt to explain the missing hours that had ended with two murders. Experienced homicide investigators understood that large files could become both an advantage and a burden. Hidden within thousands of pages might be a forgotten detail capable of changing the entire investigation. At the same time, the sheer volume of information made complete review a daunting task whenever new personnel joined the case. Investigators periodically reopened witness interviews, believing that the passage of time sometimes changes what people are willing to disclose. Relationships evolve. Fear diminishes. Memories occasionally return after unexpected triggers. Individuals who once considered a conversation insignificant may later recognize its importance after reading newspaper coverage or discussing the case with family members. Detectives contacted former witnesses, reviewed earlier statements, and compared recollections for inconsistencies or new information. Most interviews confirmed what had already been documented. A few introduced minor details, but none identified the unknown offender. Attention also focused on individuals who had entered the criminal justice system after 1987. Detectives examined violent offenders arrested for kidnappings, sexual assaults, robberies, and murders throughout the Pacific Northwest. Each new arrest raised an unavoidable question. Could this person be responsible for the deaths of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg? Investigators compared timelines, criminal histories, physical descriptions, travel patterns, and available forensic evidence. Some offenders appeared superficially similar to the unknown killer, but careful examination repeatedly eliminated them. Similar crimes do not necessarily share the same offender, and experienced investigators avoided drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. One recurring challenge involved the changing landscape of forensic science. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA analysis was advancing rapidly, but practical limitations remained considerable. Laboratories required suitable biological samples, strict contamination controls, and analytical methods that were still developing. The detectives maintained close contact with forensic specialists, asking a simple but critical question whenever technology improved. Can any of our preserved evidence now be tested in ways that were impossible before? Each scientific advancement offered renewed optimism, even when results ultimately failed to identify a suspect. The biological evidence collected from the original investigation remained carefully preserved. Evidence custodians understood the importance of maintaining proper chain of custody procedures. Every transfer between storage facilities and laboratories was documented. Every examination was recorded. Such administrative precision rarely attracts public attention, yet it forms the foundation of reliable criminal investigations. Without documented preservation, even the most significant forensic discovery can become vulnerable to legal challenge. The investigators who collected evidence in 1987 had unknowingly given future detectives their greatest opportunity simply by preserving it correctly. Meanwhile, the families continued living with uncertainty that no criminal sentence could fully erase. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries became painful reminders of lives interrupted before adulthood had truly begun. Friends established careers, married, and raised families, while Jay and Tanya remained forever frozen in the photographs distributed during the original missing persons investigation. The emotional burden extended beyond immediate relatives. Communities in British Columbia remembered the young couple not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because justice remained unfinished. The absence of answers became part of the tragedy itself. Media attention resurfaced periodically as journalists revisited notable unsolved cases from the Pacific Northwest. Each anniversary generated renewed public interest. Newspapers published photographs of the victims beside appeals for information. Television reports summarized the investigation, encouraging viewers to remember anything unusual from November 1987. Detectives understood that publicity served an important investigative purpose. Someone who had remained silent years earlier might decide to come forward. New residents might recognize names or vehicles after seeing archival coverage. Every renewed broadcast represented another opportunity, however small, to revive dormant leads. Despite these efforts, the investigation continued encountering the same fundamental obstacle. There was no identified suspect whose DNA could be compared with the preserved biological evidence. Traditional DNA profiling had transformed many criminal investigations by excluding innocent individuals or confirming the involvement of known suspects. Yet it depended upon having someone to test. Without a suspect, the genetic profile remained an unidentified signature belonging to an unknown person. Detectives possessed valuable forensic evidence but lacked a practical method for discovering whose DNA it represented. As national DNA databases gradually expanded during the 1990s, investigators submitted eligible forensic profiles whenever legal and technical requirements permitted. Such databases proved highly effective in cases where offenders had previously been arrested and required to provide DNA samples under applicable laws. Detectives hoped their unknown offender might eventually enter the criminal justice system for another crime, creating an automatic match. Months became years without success. No qualifying comparison identified the individual responsible for the murders. Whether the killer had never been arrested for a Dana-eligible offense, lived outside jurisdictions, participating in available databases, or simply remained undetected altogether could not be determined. Investigative reviews became increasingly methodical. Detectives questioned whether assumptions made during the original investigation had unintentionally narrowed the search. Could the offender have traveled farther than originally believed? Had one witness been dismissed too quickly? Did overlooked forensic techniques now exist for evidence previously considered inconclusive? Such reviews required patience rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Entire case files were read line by line. Evidence inventories were reconciled against storage records. Laboratory reports were reconsidered in light of advancing scientific knowledge. Every review reinforced one conclusion: the investigation had been thorough, but science had not yet caught up with the evidence. The murders gradually became recognized among investigators as one of the region's most significant unsolved stranger homicides. Training sessions occasionally referenced the case when discussing evidence preservation and long-term investigative strategy. Younger detectives learned how seemingly insignificant biological traces might become decisive years later. The careful work performed in 1987 served as a reminder that investigators collect evidence not only for current technology, but for scientific methods that may not yet exist. The unknown offender remained free, but the evidence connecting that person to the crime had survived intact. Throughout those years, one reality remained unchanged. Somewhere beyond the shelves of evidence, boxes, and laboratory reports, the individual responsible for abducting and murdering Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg continued living an ordinary life. That person aged alongside the investigation. Careers changed. Addresses changed. Technology transformed daily existence. Entire generations entered adulthood unaware that one of the Pacific Northwest's most disturbing unsolved double murders still lacked an identified offender. Yet hidden inside refrigerated evidence storage and meticulously documented forensic files, investigators unknowingly possessed the means to end decades of uncertainty. They simply needed a scientific revolution capable of transforming an anonymous DNA profile into a human identity, a breakthrough that was still years away, but growing closer with every advancement in forensic genetics. Years passed with no arrest, but the investigation never truly stopped. Behind the scenes, the case continued to move through cycles familiar to every major cold case. New detectives inherited the files. Veteran investigators shared institutional knowledge before retiring. Evidence custodians verified inventories, ensuring that every exhibit collected in 1987 remained properly preserved. Whenever forensic science advanced, the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case returned to the laboratory for another review. Each new development offered hope, yet each review ended with the same conclusion. The killer had left behind biological evidence, but investigators still had no reliable way to determine whose DNA it was. By the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, DNA profiling had become one of the most powerful investigative tools in criminal justice. Across North America, violent offenders were being identified through forensic evidence that only a decade earlier would have remained scientifically useless. Cases once dependent upon eyewitness testimony now rested on microscopic biological traces invisible to the naked eye. Public confidence in forensic science grew rapidly as prosecutors presented DNA evidence capable of identifying suspects with extraordinary accuracy. For detectives assigned to the Cook and Van Quedlinburg investigation, those advances were encouraging, but they also highlighted the one obstacle that continued to block progress. Traditional DNA analysis answers a specific question. It determines whether a known individual's genetic profile matches evidence recovered from a crime scene. It does not automatically identify an unknown person. Without a suspect or a qualifying profile already stored in a criminal database, investigators remain trapped. They possessed an unidentified genetic signature, but no name attached to it. The evidence proved that another person had been present. It simply could not reveal who that person was. As national DNA databases expanded, detectives submitted the forensic profile for comparison whenever new systems or updated procedures became available. Every search carried the possibility that the offender had since been arrested elsewhere for a qualifying offense requiring DNA collection. Investigators understood that many long unsolved cases had been solved exactly that way. A burglary arrest in one state might unexpectedly solve a decades-old homicide in another. Each database search therefore represented another opportunity for justice. The results were always the same. No match. Every negative result narrowed possibilities without providing answers. Either the offender had never been required to provide a DNA sample, had died before entering the system, lived outside participating jurisdictions, or simply remained unidentified by law enforcement altogether. Detectives refused to interpret the absence of a database match as failure. Instead, they viewed it as information. The unknown offender likely had avoided circumstances that would have placed his DNA into available criminal databases. Investigators also revisited offender profiles developed during the original investigation. Behavioral analysis had never identified a single suspect, but it had helped establish broad characteristics consistent with the available evidence. The offender appeared capable of controlling two victims over an extended period. He demonstrated enough confidence to transport victims between locations without immediate detection. He selected disposal sites offering isolation and delayed discovery. None of those observations identified an individual, but together they suggested organization rather than impulsive violence. Detectives remained cautious, however. Behavioral analysis can guide investigations, but physical evidence, not psychological theory, must ultimately identify the offender. The preserved biological evidence remained the investigation's greatest asset. Advances in laboratory technology allowed scientists to obtain increasingly detailed genetic profiles from samples that earlier generations of forensic experts would have considered inadequate. New extraction methods recovered DNA from smaller quantities of biological material while reducing contamination risks. Analysts repeated examinations using improved instrumentation, confirming the integrity of the preserved evidence. Each successful laboratory result reinforced the same remarkable fact. The evidence collected in 1987 had survived decades in a condition suitable for modern forensic analysis. That outcome was far from guaranteed. Evidence storage demands discipline extending over many years. Temperature control, secure packaging, documented handling procedures, and careful preservation all influence whether biological samples remain scientifically useful decades later. Countless criminal investigations have suffered because critical evidence deteriorated, became contaminated, or was inadvertently destroyed before technology advanced sufficiently to examine it. In this investigation, meticulous preservation ensured that future scientists would inherit evidence capable of answering questions impossible to solve when it was first collected. The victims' families remained closely connected to the investigation despite the passage of time. Detectives periodically updated relatives whenever significant forensic developments occurred, even when those developments failed to produce immediate results. Such conversations required extraordinary sensitivity. The families learned to balance hope against experience. Every announcement of improved DNA technology seemed capable of ending decades of uncertainty. Yet year after year, the investigation continued without an arrest. Hope survived, but it became increasingly cautious. Meanwhile, the case gained recognition among homicide investigators throughout North America as an example of both exceptional evidence preservation and the extraordinary difficulty of stranger-on-stranger homicide investigations. Conferences discussing cold cases occasionally reference the murders when examining long-term investigative strategies. Detectives emphasized that unresolved cases should never be considered permanently unsolvable. Scientific progress repeatedly demonstrated that evidence collected decades earlier could become decisive under new laboratory techniques. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation remained one of the strongest examples of why every biological sample deserved careful preservation, regardless of current technological limitations. By the early 2010s, another transformation began quietly reshaping forensic investigations around the world. It did not originate within traditional criminal laboratories. Instead, it emerged from ordinary people exploring family history. Millions of individuals voluntarily submitted DNA samples to commercial genealogy services in hopes of discovering distant relatives, tracing ancestral origins, or constructing detailed family trees. Their goal was personal curiosity, not criminal investigation. Yet collectively, those databases created something unprecedented, an enormous network of genetic relationships extending across generations. For homicide investigators, the implications were profound. Even if an offender had never submitted DNA personally, close or distant biological relatives might have done so. Shared genetic markers could reveal family connections, allowing investigators to narrow an unknown DNA profile toward a particular family line. The science did not produce an immediate name. Instead, it generated investigative leads requiring extensive genealogical research, historical records, public documents, and traditional detective work. The approach became known as investigative genetic genealogy. At first, the method remained experimental. Only a small number of specialists possessed the expertise necessary to combine forensic genetics with professional genealogical research. Legal, ethical, and technical questions continued evolving as investigators explored the new methodology. Many law enforcement agencies observed cautiously, recognizing the enormous potential while waiting for proven success. Then, one landmark case changed everything. In 2018, investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to identify Joseph James D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer, solving a series of murders and sexual assaults that had remained unsolved for decades. The arrest demonstrated that unknown offenders could be identified even without prior arrests or entries in traditional criminal DNA databases. Across the United States, cold case investigators immediately recognized the significance of that breakthrough. Cases once considered nearly impossible suddenly appeared solvable. Among those watching closely were the detectives responsible for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. For the first time in more than 30 years, investigators possessed not merely preserved biological evidence, but a realistic pathway toward transforming that anonymous DNA profile into the identity of a living human being. The evidence had remained silent since 1987. Now, because science had advanced beyond anything imaginable when the murders occurred, that silence was beginning to break. The investigation stood on the threshold of its most important chapter, not because witnesses had come forward or a suspect had confessed, but because a tiny biological trace preserved decades earlier was finally about to reveal the family history of the man who had believed he would never be found. The breakthrough did not arrive with flashing police lights, a dramatic confession, or a chance encounter during a routine traffic stop. It began inside a forensic laboratory, where investigators returned once again to evidence that had remained carefully preserved since November 1987. For more than 3 decades, that biological sample had represented both hope and frustration. It proved that the unknown offender had left behind genetic material, yet conventional DNA testing had failed to transform that profile into a name. Now, inspired by the emerging success of investigative genetic genealogy, detectives believed the same evidence could finally reveal what years of traditional investigation had not. The decision to pursue genetic genealogy marked one of the most significant moments in the history of the case. It was not taken lightly. Unlike traditional forensic comparisons, investigative genetic genealogy required cooperation between forensic scientists, genealogists, detectives, prosecutors, and specialists capable of interpreting enormous amounts of family history data. The process demanded patience, precision, and strict adherence to legal procedures. Detectives understood that the technology could generate powerful investigative leads, but every conclusion would still require independent corroboration through conventional police work before an arrest could be considered. The preserved DNA profile was prepared for advanced analysis using modern laboratory methods unavailable in 1987. Scientists generated a genetic profile suitable for genealogical comparison, extracting far more information than earlier forensic testing had been capable of producing. Unlike standard criminal database searches, which seek an exact match with an individual already known to law enforcement, genetic genealogy searches focus on shared DNA segments that indicate biological relationships. Even distant relatives can provide valuable clues. A third cousin, living hundreds of miles away, may unknowingly help identify an unknown suspect through a shared family lineage reaching back generations. When the genealogical analysis began, investigators did not expect an immediate answer. The process rarely produces one. Instead, specialists typically receive a collection of partial genetic matches representing individuals who share varying degrees of biological relationship with the unknown person. None of those individuals are suspects simply because they appear in the results. They are relatives, sometimes close, often distant, whose family trees become the starting point for painstaking genealogical reconstruction. Professional genealogists began building those family trees branch by branch. Birth certificates, marriage records, census documents, obituaries, military records, newspaper archives, cemetery registries, and publicly available historical documents were examined in extraordinary detail. Every generation expanded the investigation further into the past before narrowing again toward the present. Families divided into multiple branches. Children grew into adults with descendants of their own. Surnames changed through marriage. Individuals relocated across states. Entire family networks had to be reconstructed before detectives could determine which branch might ultimately lead to the unknown offender. The work demanded remarkable discipline. Investigative genetic genealogy is not a computer automatically identifying a suspect. It is a collaborative process combining advanced science with exhaustive historical research. Every assumption requires verification. Every relationship must be supported by documentary evidence. Detectives met regularly with genealogists, comparing emerging family structures against known facts from the homicide investigation. Geographic locations, ages, travel histories, and other investigative details gradually became filters capable of reducing an enormous family network to a manageable number of potential individuals. As weeks turned into months, the family tree narrowed. The unidentified DNA profile no longer represented an anonymous biological signature. It now appeared connected to a specific family lineage with roots extending through Washington state. Investigators continued eliminating individuals whose age, whereabouts, or documented circumstances clearly excluded them. Others remained under closer scrutiny. Detectives quietly conducted background research, examining employment records, residential histories, criminal histories where applicable, and geographic connections to locations relevant to the murders. Every step required caution. At this stage, no one had been identified as the offender. The genealogy merely indicated that the answer likely existed somewhere within a particular extended family. Eventually, one individual began attracting increasing investigative attention. His age was consistent with the evidence. His known history placed him within the broader geographic region connected to the crimes. Most importantly, further investigation suggested that obtaining a direct DNA comparison would either eliminate him completely or move the investigation toward the first major breakthrough in more than 30 years. At this point, detectives shifted from genealogical research back to traditional investigative methods. Genetic genealogy itself does not establish criminal guilt. It generates leads. To prove that the person identified through genealogical analysis was actually the source of the forensic DNA, investigators required a legally obtained reference sample suitable for direct laboratory comparison with the evidence collected in 1987. Surveillance began carefully and discreetly. Investigators documented the suspect's daily activities without alerting him to the ongoing investigation. After decades without public progress, maintaining secrecy became essential. Detectives understood that premature disclosure could jeopardize the entire operation. If the suspect became aware of the investigation, opportunities to collect a lawful reference sample might disappear. Surveillance teams therefore operated methodically, observing movements while waiting for circumstances that would allow investigators to recover biological material abandoned in a public setting, consistent with applicable legal standards. Such evidence collection has become a familiar component of modern forensic investigations. Individuals routinely discard items containing biological material, drinking containers, food packaging, tissues, or other objects carrying saliva or skin cells. Once lawfully abandoned, such items may provide investigators with DNA suitable for comparison. Detectives carefully selected opportunities consistent with legal requirements, ensuring that every step could later withstand judicial scrutiny. The recovered sample was submitted for forensic examination. Laboratory scientists compared the newly obtained DNA profile against the biological evidence preserved from the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Unlike genealogical analysis, which estimates biological relationships across extended family networks, this comparison required an exact forensic evaluation. Either the profiles originated from the same individual, or they did not. There was no middle ground. Investigators waited. For many detectives assigned to the case, this was the moment decades of investigative work had been leading toward. Some members of the original investigative team had already retired. Others had passed away without witnessing the outcome. New generations of detectives now stood where their predecessors had once stood, relying upon evidence collected long before many of them had entered law enforcement. Every careful decision made in 1987, the preservation of biological material, the documentation of chain of custody, the refusal to discard evidence considered scientifically limited at the time, had brought the investigation to this point. When the laboratory completed its comparison, the results were unequivocal. The DNA recovered through the investigation matched the biological evidence collected during the original homicide investigation. After more than 3 decades, the anonymous genetic profile finally belonged to a specific individual. The unknown killer was no longer unknown. The forensic evidence that had remained silent since 1987 had spoken with scientific certainty. For investigators, the emotional significance of the result was difficult to overstate. Years of unanswered questions, repeated evidence reviews, unsuccessful database searches, and countless investigative theories had finally converged upon a single confirmed identity. Yet despite the extraordinary breakthrough, detectives understood that their work was not finished. DNA established an extraordinarily powerful connection, but prosecutors would ultimately require a complete evidentiary case demonstrating not only identity, but the circumstances surrounding the crimes. Investigators immediately began assembling every available piece of corroborating evidence, preparing for the moment when one of the Pacific Northwest's longest unsolved double murders would finally move from a cold case file into a criminal courtroom. The DNA identification transformed the investigation overnight, but it did not immediately become public. Inside police offices and prosecutor meeting rooms, the atmosphere shifted from decades of uncertainty to careful preparation. Detectives had spent years searching for a name. Now they had one. Every decision that followed had to withstand the scrutiny of a criminal trial. A single procedural mistake could jeopardize the strongest forensic breakthrough the case had ever seen. Investigators therefore moved deliberately, treating the identification not as the end of the investigation, but as the beginning of its final and most critical phase. The man identified through investigative genetic genealogy was William Earl Talbot II. Born years before the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, Talbot had been in his mid-20s at the time of the crimes in 1987. Investigators immediately began reconstructing his life as it existed during that period. They examined employment history, residential records, vehicle ownership, and known movements. Detectives compared documented facts against the timeline established decades earlier. Their objective was not to force evidence to fit a theory, but to determine whether independent records supported the forensic identification already produced by DNA. Every confirmed detail mattered. Cold cases differ from newly committed crimes in one important respect. Physical evidence may remain intact, but memories inevitably fade. Witnesses relocate. Businesses close. Records disappear. Detectives therefore relied heavily on archived documents preserved through earlier investigative work. Original reports prepared in 1987 became indispensable once again. Handwritten notes taken by detectives decades earlier now sat beside digital forensic reports generated using 21st century technology. The investigation had become a collaboration across generations of investigators who had never worked together, but whose efforts now intersected through preserved evidence. Once investigators confirmed that Talbot remained alive, surveillance resumed. Detectives documented his activities while continuing to gather corroborating evidence wherever possible. The investigation remained confidential. Public disclosure before formal legal action could compromise interviews, influence potential witnesses, or create unnecessary complications. Prosecutors and detectives coordinated every significant step, ensuring that evidence collection, warrant preparation, and arrest planning complied fully with applicable legal requirements. At the same time, investigators revisited every major component of the original case through the lens of the new identification. They reviewed witness statements to determine whether anyone had unknowingly described an individual consistent with Talbot. They re-examined geographic connections between his known history and the locations associated with the murders. Although the DNA evidence represented the investigation's central breakthrough, detectives understood that a comprehensive prosecution benefits from multiple independent lines of evidence whenever possible. Every corroborating fact strengthened the overall case. The forensic match itself remained extraordinary. Unlike circumstantial evidence requiring layers of interpretation, DNA comparison follows established scientific principles. Independent laboratory procedures, statistical analysis, quality control measures, and documented chain of custody protocols collectively provide an exceptionally reliable method of determining whether biological evidence originated from a particular individual. In this investigation, the preserved biological evidence collected in 1987 had remained suitable for modern forensic examination because investigators decades earlier had handled and stored it with remarkable care. Their professionalism became one of the case's defining strengths. As preparations continued, detectives reflected upon the extraordinary path the investigation had taken. When the murders occurred, DNA profiling itself remained in its infancy. Investigative genetic genealogy did not yet exist. Personal computers were uncommon in police work. Cellular telephones were rare. The internet had not become part of everyday life. Had investigators failed to preserve biological evidence properly in 1987, no scientific advancement could have recovered what had been lost. The eventual identification of Talbot therefore depended as much upon disciplined evidence preservation as upon revolutionary forensic technology. The families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were informed before the public announcement. For relatives who had lived with unanswered questions since November 1987, the news arrived with overwhelming emotion. More than 3 decades had passed since the murders. Parents had aged. Siblings had built lives while carrying permanent grief. Hope had survived through countless disappointments, but experience had taught them to guard against premature optimism. This time, investigators explained, the evidence was different. This was not another promising lead or speculative theory. It was a scientifically supported identification confirmed through modern forensic analysis. No announcement could restore the lives that had been taken. No arrest could erase decades of absence. But for the first time since the murders, the investigation possessed a clear direction grounded in evidence rather than uncertainty. On May 18, 2018, law enforcement officers arrested William Earl Talbot CN in Washington state. The arrest marked the first time anyone had been formally charged in connection with the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. News spread rapidly throughout North America. Newspapers, television networks, and online publications reported that one of the Pacific Northwest's longest unsolved double homicide investigations had reached a dramatic turning point through the use of investigative genetic genealogy. The case immediately attracted international attention because it demonstrated the extraordinary potential of emerging forensic methods. For many observers, the announcement carried broader significance beyond a single criminal investigation. Only weeks earlier, investigators had publicly identified the Golden State Killer using the same general investigative approach. Now another decades-old homicide case had reached an arrest through forensic genealogy. Together, these investigations fundamentally changed the conversation surrounding cold cases. Detectives across the United States and beyond began reconsidering evidence preserved in storage rooms for decades. Biological samples once believed incapable of identifying unknown offenders suddenly appeared filled with new investigative possibilities. Yet experienced investigators resisted celebrating too soon. An arrest is not a conviction. The criminal justice process required careful presentation of evidence before an impartial court. Prosecutors prepared formal charges while defense attorneys examined every aspect of the investigation, including the forensic procedures used to identify the suspect. The legal system demanded rigorous scrutiny precisely because of the seriousness of the allegations. Detectives welcomed that scrutiny. They believed the investigation had been conducted lawfully and scientifically, and they expected the evidence to withstand examination. Meanwhile, members of the original investigative team watched developments with profound satisfaction. Some had retired years earlier, convinced that the murders might never be solved despite their best efforts. Others had devoted significant portions of their careers to preserving evidence and maintaining investigative records in the hope that future technology would succeed where contemporary methods had failed. The arrest validated decades of persistence. It demonstrated that cold cases do not become less important with time. They simply wait for the moment when evidence and science finally converge. The announcement also renewed public interest in Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg themselves for years. Discussions of the case had centered upon its mystery. Now attention returned to the two young Canadians whose lives had been interrupted during an ordinary trip across the border. Friends and relatives remembered their kindness, their plans, and the ordinary future they had expected to share. Behind every forensic breakthrough and every courtroom proceeding remained the simple truth that two young people had left home, believing they would soon return. More than 30 years later, the justice system was finally preparing to answer for the violence that had stolen that future away. The arrest of William Earl Talbot the marked a historic turning point in the investigation, but it also opened an entirely new chapter inside the courtroom. For prosecutors, identifying the suspect through DNA was only the beginning. They now carried the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Talbot was responsible for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. Decades had passed since the crimes. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Some individuals connected to the original investigation were no longer alive. Yet the physical evidence, carefully preserved since 1987, remained remarkably intact, and it would become the foundation of one of the most closely watched cold case prosecutions in Washington state. Defense attorneys immediately scrutinized every stage of the investigation. They examined the original crime scene documentation, the chain of custody for every piece of evidence, laboratory procedures, and, most notably, the use of investigative genetic genealogy. At the time, the technique was still relatively new in criminal investigations. Although the final identification had been confirmed through conventional forensic DNA testing, the investigative path that led detectives to Talbot attracted national attention. Legal observers across the United States watched closely because the outcome could influence how future cold cases would be investigated using similar methods. Prosecutors emphasized a critical distinction. Investigative genetic genealogy had not been presented as proof of guilt. Instead, it functioned as an investigative tool that generated a lead, much like an anonymous tip or a witness statement. Once detectives identified Talbot as a possible suspect, they obtained a separate DNA sample through lawful investigative procedures. That independently collected sample was then compared directly to the biological evidence preserved from the murders. It was that forensic comparison, not the genealogical research itself, that prosecutors relied upon as scientific evidence in court. As preparations continued, investigators returned to the original case files with renewed intensity. Reports prepared more than 30 years earlier were reviewed line by line. Detectives compared handwritten notes with digital records, ensuring consistency throughout the evidentiary record. Every photograph taken at the crime scenes was cataloged again. Every laboratory report was examined for completeness. Prosecutors understood that jurors would be asked to evaluate evidence collected in 1987 through the lens of modern forensic science. Clear organization and careful explanation would therefore be essential. The trial drew considerable public interest. Journalists covering criminal justice and forensic science recognized that the proceedings represented more than the prosecution of a single defendant. The case illustrated how technological advances could reshape investigations that once appeared permanently unsolved. Families of victims from other cold cases followed developments closely, hoping that similar scientific breakthroughs might one day bring answers in their own cases. Detectives from jurisdictions across North America observed the proceedings, aware that the legal treatment of investigative genetic genealogy could influence future homicide investigations. Throughout the trial, prosecutors carefully reconstructed the events supported by physical evidence. They presented testimony describing the original investigation, the discovery of the victims, the collection and preservation of forensic evidence, and the subsequent scientific analyses that eventually identified Talbot. Expert witnesses explained DNA methodology in language intended to be understandable to jurors unfamiliar with forensic genetics. They described how biological samples are collected, preserved, analyzed, and statistically evaluated. The objective was not to overwhelm the jury with scientific terminology, but to demonstrate the reliability of the forensic conclusions through clear, transparent explanation. The defense challenged various aspects of the prosecution's case, including the interpretation of evidence and investigative procedures. Such challenges are a fundamental component of the criminal justice system, particularly in cases involving allegations of the most serious offenses. The adversarial process requires prosecutors to establish the strength of their evidence while allowing the defense to test every significant conclusion. For a case that had remained unsolved for more than 3 decades, that scrutiny was especially important. As testimony unfolded, jurors heard how investigators had never abandoned the murders despite the absence of immediate suspects. They learned about the careful preservation of biological evidence and the repeated forensic reviews conducted as technology advanced. They also heard how investigative genetic genealogy eventually directed detectives toward a family line that ultimately led to Talbot, after which conventional forensic DNA testing confirmed the match. The prosecution argued that this combination of scientific evidence and investigative diligence finally solved a mystery that had endured since 1987. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, attending the proceedings carried profound emotional weight. More than 30 years had passed since they first received the devastating news that their loved ones had been murdered. The courtroom represented the first opportunity to hear the evidence presented publicly before a jury. It was not merely a legal process, but the culmination of decades of waiting, uncertainty, and perseverance. Every witness, every exhibit, and every forensic explanation brought the case closer to a conclusion that had once seemed impossible. In June 2019, after considering the evidence presented during the trial, a jury found William Earl Talbot Desi guilty of the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. The verdict marked the first conviction in the case since the crimes occurred in November 1987. It concluded one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running homicide investigations and represented a landmark application of investigative genetic genealogy in criminal justice. Following the conviction, Talbot was sentenced in accordance with Washington state law. For investigators, prosecutors, forensic scientists, and the victims' families, the verdict brought a measure of legal accountability after decades of uncertainty. Although no judicial outcome could restore the lives that had been lost, the conviction established responsibility through the criminal justice process and formally ended the case's status as an unsolved double homicide. The significance of the investigation extended far beyond a single courtroom. The successful identification and prosecution demonstrated that biological evidence preserved decades earlier could retain extraordinary investigative value when combined with advancing forensic science. Law enforcement agencies throughout the United States began reviewing other unsolved homicide cases involving preserved DNA evidence, recognizing that investigative genetic genealogy had become a practical tool rather than a theoretical possibility. Numerous cold case units expanded efforts to identify unknown offenders using similar methods, always subject to evolving legal standards and judicial oversight. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remain remembered not only because of their tragic circumstances, but because they fundamentally changed expectations surrounding cold case investigations. For more than 30 years, the case symbolized the frustration of an unidentified killer who appeared to have vanished without leaving investigators enough evidence for an arrest. In reality, the evidence had been present from the very beginning. It simply required scientific capabilities that did not yet exist in 1987. The detectives who collected and preserved that evidence could not have imagined precisely how future technology would evolve, but their commitment to meticulous forensic practice ensured that, decades later, science would finally speak for the victims when no eyewitness remained able to do so. When the courtroom proceedings concluded, the headlines focused on a remarkable statistic. More than 30 years had passed between the murders and the conviction, yet behind that number lay a far more important story. The resolution of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case was not the result of a lucky break or a sudden confession. It was the product of decades of disciplined investigative work, careful evidence preservation, scientific innovation, and the determination of investigators who refuse to accept that time alone should determine whether justice is possible. One of the most significant lessons from the investigation involved the preservation of physical evidence. In 1987, detectives and forensic technicians operated with technology that was primitive compared with modern DNA analysis. They could not foresee investigative genetic genealogy, high-throughput sequencing, or the sophisticated forensic software available decades later. Nevertheless, they followed established evidence handling procedures with exceptional care. Biological samples were properly collected, packaged, documented, and stored. Every transfer of evidence was recorded through chain of custody documentation. That professionalism ensured the integrity of forensic material across more than 3 decades. Forensic scientists often describe evidence as a silent witness. Unlike human memory, biological evidence does not become confused by time, media coverage, or repeated interviews. It remains unchanged, waiting for the scientific tools capable of interpreting it. In the J. Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg investigation, that silent witness waited more than 30 years before modern laboratory methods unlocked its full value. The offender had unknowingly left behind the one piece of evidence that would ultimately identify him, even though no technology existed at the time capable of revealing his name. The investigation also demonstrated the limitations of traditional DNA databases. Prior to the use of investigative genetic genealogy, detectives repeatedly searched available criminal DNA systems without identifying the offender. This outcome did not indicate that the forensic evidence lacked value. Instead, it reflected the structure of conventional databases. Such systems compare unknown crime scene DNA against profiles already collected from qualifying individuals under applicable laws. If an offender has never provided a DNA sample, the database cannot generate a match regardless of the quality of the forensic evidence. Investigative genetic genealogy fundamentally expanded that investigative framework. Rather than requiring the offender's own DNA profile, it searched for biological relationships among individuals who had voluntarily participated in genealogy research and whose data were available for law enforcement use under applicable policies. The resulting family connections became investigative leads, not courtroom evidence by themselves. Detectives still relied upon traditional police work to identify potential suspects and independent forensic testing to confirm the identity of the individual responsible. The distinction remains critical. Genealogy pointed investigators in the right direction. Conventional DNA comparison provided the evidentiary confirmation. The success of the investigation encouraged law enforcement agencies throughout North America to reassess long unsolved homicide cases involving preserved biological evidence. Detectives revisited storage facilities containing evidence collected decades earlier. Cases previously considered unlikely to be solved suddenly acquired new investigative potential. Cold case units expanded collaborations with forensic laboratories and professional genealogists, recognizing that advances in science had dramatically altered the possibilities available to criminal investigators. At the same time, the growing use of investigative genetic genealogy prompted important legal and ethical discussions. Quartets, legislators, privacy experts, forensic scientists, and law enforcement agencies examined how the technology should be applied while balancing investigative needs with personal privacy considerations. Policies governing the use of genealogy databases evolved over time, reflecting both technological capability and public expectations regarding genetic information. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation became one of several landmark cases frequently discussed during those conversations because it demonstrated both the extraordinary investigative value and the importance of carefully regulated procedures. For the victims' families, however, the broader policy debates remained secondary to a much more personal reality. The conviction represented the first time the criminal justice system formally identified the individual responsible for taking J.I. Pam and Tanya's lives. Decades of unanswered questions had finally been replaced by judicial findings supported by scientific evidence. Although grief does not disappear with a verdict, many families describe the conclusion of criminal proceedings as ending one chapter of uncertainty, allowing remembrance to become less dominated by unanswered questions. The investigation also highlighted the importance of international cooperation. Because the victims were Canadian citizens and the crimes occurred in the United States, authorities from both countries contributed to different aspects of the case over many years. Information sharing, coordinated investigative efforts, and communication with the victims' families remained essential throughout the investigation. Such cross-border cooperation has become increasingly important in modern criminal investigations as travel, communication, and forensic evidence frequently extend beyond national boundaries. For investigators who entered law enforcement long after the murders occurred, the case offered a powerful reminder that cold cases are not abandoned cases. Many of the detectives who ultimately contributed to the successful resolution had not participated in the original investigation. Instead, they inherited the work of earlier generations, building upon preserved evidence and carefully documented investigative records. Their success reflected continuity rather than replacement. Every detective who maintained the file, every evidence technician who verified storage conditions, every laboratory analyst who repeated testing as technology improved, and every prosecutor who prepared the final case contributed to the outcome. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg has since become a frequently cited example in forensic education, homicide investigation training, and discussions of investigative genetic genealogy. Students entering forensic science programs study the case as an illustration of why evidence preservation matters. Detectives learning cold case methodology examine the investigation to understand how persistence, documentation, and scientific progress can intersect over decades. Genealogists involved in criminal investigations reference the case as one of the early demonstrations of how family history research can assist law enforcement when applied within appropriate legal and ethical frameworks. Perhaps the investigation's greatest legacy lies in the message it sent to families whose own cases remain unsolved. Every cold case differs. Not every investigation contains preserved biological evidence suitable for modern DNA analysis. Not every offender leaves recoverable forensic traces. Yet the resolution of this case demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily weaken every investigation. In some instances, time works in favor of justice by allowing scientific capabilities to mature beyond what was once considered possible. The forests, highways, and isolated roads of Washington state remain unchanged in many places from how they appeared in November 1987. Travelers continue crossing the international border between Canada and the United States for ordinary reasons, just as Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg once did. Their story, however, has become permanently woven into the history of forensic investigation. It stands as a reminder that the smallest fragment of carefully preserved evidence may outlast generations of investigators, waiting patiently until science finally provides the voice that victims themselves can no longer offer. The conclusion of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg investigation marked far more than the resolution of a single homicide case. It became a defining moment in the modern history of forensic science, demonstrating how an investigation separated from its crimes by more than 3 decades could still reach a legally supported conclusion through the combination of meticulous police work and scientific innovation. For homicide investigators across North America, the case reinforced an enduring principle. Evidence does not lose its value simply because years pass. In many instances, its value increases as technology evolves. Following the conviction, law enforcement agencies throughout the United States began conducting systematic reviews of unsolved homicide files containing preserved biological evidence. Cold case units that had once focused primarily on witness re-interviews and traditional investigative methods increasingly incorporated forensic genealogy into their long-term strategies. Detectives collaborated with forensic laboratories, prosecutors, genealogists, and legal advisors to determine which investigations might benefit from advanced DNA analysis. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case was regularly cited during these discussions because it illustrated every stage of the process from careful evidence preservation in 1987 to successful identification through modern forensic methods more than 30 years later. Training programs for homicide investigators also evolved. Rather than emphasizing only crime scene processing for immediate prosecutions, instructors increasingly highlighted the importance of collecting and preserving evidence for technologies that might not yet exist. Every biological sample, fingerprint, trace fiber, or digital record could someday become more valuable than investigators presently understood. The detectives who worked the Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders had unknowingly prepared their case for future scientific breakthroughs simply by following disciplined forensic procedures. Their example became part of professional education for a new generation of investigators. The case further demonstrated the importance of comprehensive documentation. Throughout the decades, investigators maintained detailed reports describing evidence collection, witness interviews, laboratory examinations, and investigative decisions. Those records allowed detectives entering the case years later to understand precisely what had occurred during the original investigation. Without accurate documentation, scientific breakthroughs alone would have been insufficient. Modern investigators depended upon the careful work of their predecessors to reconstruct the investigative history and preserve the continuity necessary for eventual prosecution. Another enduring lesson involved interagency cooperation. The investigation required sustained collaboration between Canadian and American authorities, local law enforcement agencies, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and later, specialists in investigative genetic genealogy. No single organization solved the case independently. Instead, progress resulted from coordinated efforts extending across jurisdictions and generations of professionals. Such cooperation has become increasingly important as criminal investigations frequently involve travel, communication, and forensic evidence spanning multiple regions or countries. The investigation also contributed to broader public understanding of DNA evidence. News coverage often simplifies forensic science into dramatic moments of instant identification. In reality, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation illustrated the patience required in complex cold cases. Detectives did not simply submit DNA and receive an immediate answer. They spent decades preserving evidence, conducting repeated laboratory examinations, reviewing investigative files, searching conventional DNA databases, and ultimately applying investigative genetic genealogy before confirming the offender's identity through independent forensic comparison. The process reflected persistence rather than speed. The legal proceedings following the arrest further reinforced the distinction between investigative tools and courtroom evidence. Investigative genetic genealogy served as the method by which detectives generated a promising lead. The evidentiary foundation presented at trial, however, relied upon conventional forensic DNA testing, documented investigative procedures, expert testimony, and the accumulated body of evidence developed throughout the investigation. This distinction has remained central to the responsible application of forensic genealogy in criminal investigations. For the scientific community, the case highlighted the extraordinary durability of properly preserved biological evidence. More than 30 years separated evidence collection from the forensic techniques ultimately responsible for identifying the offender. That outcome underscored why forensic laboratories emphasize rigorous evidence handling, contamination prevention, secure storage, and documented chain of custody. Scientific breakthroughs often depend not only upon new technology, but upon evidence preserved well enough to benefit from those advancements. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg continue to be referenced in discussions surrounding the evolution of cold case investigations because they occupy a unique position at the intersection of traditional detective work and modern forensic genetics. The investigation began in an era dominated by witness interviews, physical searches, and conventional laboratory techniques. It concluded in an era defined by advanced DNA analysis, digital investigative resources, and genealogical research. Few cases illustrate that transformation as clearly. Yet despite the remarkable scientific achievements associated with the investigation, the essential human story remains unchanged. In November 1987, two young Canadians set out on what should have been an ordinary trip across the border into Washington state. Their journey ended in violence, leaving families devastated and investigators confronting one of the region's most difficult homicide investigations. For decades, the absence of answers became part of the tragedy itself. Scientific innovation eventually identified the person responsible, but it did not alter the loss experienced by those who knew Jay and Tanya. The case serves as a reminder that behind every forensic advancement are individuals whose lives were permanently changed by violent crime. DNA profiles, laboratory reports, genealogical charts, and courtroom exhibits all exist in service of a single objective: establishing the truth as accurately as possible through reliable evidence. In this investigation, that objective required more than 30 years of perseverance before science could finally reveal what investigators had suspected from the beginning: that the evidence had always contained the answer. Today, the names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg are remembered not only because of the circumstances of their deaths, but because their case reshaped expectations surrounding unsolved homicide investigations. Detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and students of criminal justice continue studying the investigation as an example of how careful evidence preservation, disciplined investigative practice, and advancing technology can converge across generations to resolve crimes once believed destined to remain mysteries. Their story stands as one of the clearest demonstrations that although time may delay justice, it does not necessarily prevent it when evidence is preserved. Science continues to advance, and investigators refuse to stop searching for the truth. When historians of criminal investigation examine the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg occupy a distinctive place in that history. The case bridges two very different eras of forensic science. It began in a world where homicide investigations relied overwhelmingly on eyewitness accounts, fingerprints, ballistics, and painstaking detective work conducted without digital databases or modern genetic technology. It concluded in an era where DNA sequencing, computational genealogy, and advanced forensic analysis could identify an unknown offender from biological evidence preserved decades earlier. Few investigations illustrate that transformation as clearly. The original investigators in 1987 could not have anticipated the scientific developments that would emerge over the following 30 years. At the time, DNA profiling itself was still an emerging forensic discipline, available only in limited circumstances and requiring substantially larger biological samples than modern techniques. Investigative genetic genealogy had not yet been conceived as a practical law enforcement tool. Commercial ancestry databases did not exist. Personal computers were only beginning to enter workplaces, and police records remained largely paper-based. Yet despite those technological limitations, investigators approached the crime scenes with the same fundamental principles that continue to define professional homicide investigations today. Document everything. Preserve every recoverable item of evidence, maintain chain of custody, and avoid assumptions unsupported by facts. Those principles ultimately proved more important than any individual technological breakthrough. Throughout the decades that followed, every generation of investigators inherited the work of those who came before. Detectives who had never met the original investigators relied upon reports written in 1987. Modern forensic scientists examined evidence packaged by technicians working more than 3 decades earlier. Prosecutors preparing for trial studied handwritten notes created long before digital case management systems became standard. The investigation became an extraordinary example of continuity within the criminal justice system, demonstrating that careful documentation can allow professional knowledge to survive across generations. The influence of the case extended beyond homicide investigations. Forensic laboratories increasingly emphasized long-term evidence preservation protocols, recognizing that biological material once considered insufficient for meaningful analysis might later become suitable as laboratory methods improved. Crime scene investigators reinforced training emphasizing contamination prevention, detailed documentation, and comprehensive evidence collection. These practices had always been considered important, but the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation provided a powerful real-world demonstration of their long-term significance. The case also encouraged broader collaboration between scientific disciplines that historically operated more independently. Geneticists, genealogists, forensic biologists, detectives, prosecutors, and legal scholars increasingly found themselves working together on complex investigations involving advanced DNA analysis. Each discipline contributed specialized expertise while remaining subject to established legal standards governing criminal investigations. The successful resolution of the case demonstrated that multidisciplinary cooperation could achieve results impossible for any single profession acting alone. Public awareness of forensic science changed as well. Television dramas often portray criminal investigations as rapid sequences of laboratory discoveries leading almost immediately to arrests. The reality revealed by the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg investigation was considerably different. Scientific progress required decades. Laboratory breakthroughs depended upon evidence collected years earlier. Genealogical analysis required painstaking historical research. Detectives spent months verifying investigative leads before making an arrest. The case, therefore, provided a more accurate illustration of modern forensic investigation, one characterized by patience, precision, collaboration, and careful legal procedure, rather than instantaneous solutions. Another lasting contribution of the investigation involves the continuing evolution of cold case philosophy in earlier decades. The term cold case often implied that meaningful investigative progress had become unlikely. Increasingly, however, law enforcement agencies have adopted a different perspective. Advances in forensic science, digital record analysis, and investigative technology mean that unsolved cases may become more solvable over time rather than less. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation remains one of the clearest examples supporting that view. For more than 30 years, the evidence appeared insufficient to identify the offender. In reality, the evidence was simply waiting for scientific capabilities to mature. The investigation has also been referenced in discussions concerning public trust in forensic evidence. DNA analysis commands considerable confidence within the criminal justice system because it rests upon well-established scientific principles, standardized laboratory procedures, and rigorous quality assurance. At the same time, the case reminds investigators and prosecutors that scientific evidence must always be interpreted within the broader context of a complete criminal investigation. DNA identifies biological relationships and physical presence under particular circumstances, but detectives must still establish timelines, evaluate witness testimony, and reconstruct events using multiple independent sources of evidence whenever possible. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, the broader historical significance of the investigation can never outweigh the deeply personal loss experienced in November 1987. Every anniversary remains a reminder of two lives interrupted before adulthood had fully unfolded. Friends who once expected to build futures alongside them instead spent decades remembering birthdays that never came, milestones never reached, and conversations forever left unfinished. The scientific achievements associated with the case exist because investigators sought justice for those two young people and the families who never stopped waiting for answers. Today, criminal justice professionals frequently describe the investigation as a landmark, not because it introduced entirely new scientific concepts, but because it demonstrated how existing principles, careful evidence preservation, persistent investigation, interdisciplinary cooperation, and responsible application of emerging technology could converge to solve a crime separated from its prosecution by more than 3 decades. It stands as evidence that the passage of time alone does not determine whether justice remains possible. The forests of Washington state have continued to grow, highways have expanded, communities have changed. New generations travel the same roads without realizing that those quiet landscapes once concealed one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring homicide mysteries. Yet within the history of forensic science and criminal investigation, the names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remain permanently connected to a case that transformed expectations surrounding cold case investigations. Their story continues to remind investigators throughout the world that evidence, when protected with care and examined through advancing science, can preserve the truth far longer than memory itself, and that even after decades of silence, that truth may still find its voice. In the years following the conviction, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg came to represent something larger than the successful resolution of a single criminal investigation. Within law enforcement, forensic science, and criminal justice education, the case became a benchmark against which other cold case investigations were measured. Detectives studying unsolved homicides frequently returned to the investigation because it demonstrated an essential reality. While memories fade and investigative opportunities may narrow, properly preserved physical evidence can remain as reliable decades later as it was on the day it was collected. The case also reinforced the importance of patience in homicide investigations. Public attention often demands immediate answers, rapid arrests, and clear explanations. Investigators rarely have that luxury. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg investigation unfolded across multiple jurisdictions, involved hundreds of interviews, repeated forensic examinations, and decades of technological change before reaching its conclusion. Throughout that period, investigators resisted the temptation to pursue unsupported theories simply to provide closure. Instead, they remained committed to the evidence, even when the evidence appeared insufficient to identify the offender. That disciplined approach ultimately proved correct. One of the most enduring lessons concerns the role of continuity within law enforcement agencies. The detectives who solved the case were not the same investigators who first responded to the murders in November 1987. Over more than 30 years, personnel retired, transferred, or concluded their careers. Yet the investigation itself survived because each generation preserved knowledge for the next. Case files remained organized. Evidence inventories were maintained. Laboratory records were retained. Every investigator inherited not only an unsolved homicide, but also the responsibility to preserve its integrity for whoever might eventually complete the work. The successful prosecution reflected decades of collective effort rather than the accomplishments of any single individual. The investigation further highlighted the indispensable role of forensic laboratories. Scientific breakthroughs often receive public recognition only after arrests occur, But such breakthroughs depend upon years of methodical research, validation studies, quality assurance procedures, and continual technological improvement. Advances in DNA extraction, amplification, sequencing, and profile interpretation gradually expanded the range of evidence suitable for analysis. The biological material collected during the original investigation became increasingly informative as forensic capabilities advanced. The science evolved. The evidence remained constant. Investigative genetic genealogy also continued to develop after the resolution of the case. Additional agencies established specialized units capable of working with genealogists, forensic scientists, and prosecutors on particularly challenging investigations involving unidentified DNA. Professional organizations developed best practice recommendations addressing documentation, verification, privacy considerations, and appropriate investigative use. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation remained an important reference because it illustrated the value of combining genealogical research with traditional investigative procedures and independent forensic confirmation. Beyond professional circles, the case influenced how the public viewed unsolved crimes. For decades, many cold cases were regarded as historical tragedies unlikely ever to reach a courtroom. The successful identification and conviction demonstrated that scientific progress can fundamentally alter investigative possibilities. Families connected to other long unsolved homicides gained renewed hope that preserved evidence in their own cases might someday produce similar breakthroughs. While investigators remain careful to explain that not every case contains suitable biological evidence, the example provided by the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation reshaped expectations surrounding what modern forensic science could achieve. The case has also become an enduring example of why accurate historical records matter. Detectives solving decades-old crimes rely not only on preserved physical evidence, but also on the investigative decisions documented by earlier generations. Handwritten notes, witness interview summaries, crime scene diagrams, laboratory requests, and evidence logs all contribute to reconstructing events long after memories have faded. In this investigation, documentation created in 1987 remained directly relevant during courtroom proceedings more than 30 years later. The careful maintenance of those records proved almost as valuable as the biological evidence itself. For criminal justice educators, the investigation provides an opportunity to illustrate the interaction between science and law. Forensic evidence must satisfy scientific standards while also meeting legal requirements governing admissibility, reliability, and due process. Investigative genetic genealogy generated an investigative lead, but prosecutors relied upon independently obtained DNA evidence, corroborating investigative findings, and established forensic procedures when presenting the case at trial. The distinction remains fundamental to understanding how emerging technologies are incorporated into criminal investigations while preserving fairness within the judicial system. Despite the remarkable scientific achievements associated with the case, the investigation ultimately returns to the individuals whose lives were forever altered in November 1987. Jay Cook was 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18. Their journey across the border from British Columbia into Washington state began as an ordinary trip involving routine plans and familiar destinations. Nothing about that day suggested it would become part of criminal justice history. The extraordinary forensic developments that eventually solved the case cannot overshadow the simple fact that two young people were deprived of futures they had every reason to expect. For their families, the conclusion of the criminal proceedings represented accountability rather than closure. Courts can establish responsibility. Scientific evidence can identify offenders. Sentences can formally recognize the seriousness of criminal acts. None of these outcomes can restore lost years or replace lives taken by violence. Yet many families involved in long unsolved homicide investigations describe the identification of the offender as ending one form of uncertainty. Questions that once dominated every anniversary finally receive factual answers grounded in evidence rather than speculation. Today, investigators confronting newly discovered homicide scenes often work with technologies unavailable to the detectives who first examined the Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders. Digital imaging, advanced DNA sequencing, integrated forensic databases, geographic information systems, and sophisticated laboratory instrumentation have become routine components of modern investigations. Yet the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Protect the scene. Preserve the evidence. Document every observation. Follow the facts rather than assumptions. The resolution of this investigation demonstrates that those principles retain their value regardless of how dramatically technology evolves. More than 30 years separated the crime from the conviction, but the investigation stands as enduring proof that justice is not measured solely by speed. Sometimes it depends upon the willingness of investigators, scientists, prosecutors, and families to continue believing that the truth remains discoverable, even when decades pass without answers. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg has therefore become more than the history of a solved homicide. It has become part of the continuing history of forensic science itself, reminding every generation of investigators that evidence, when preserved with care and examined through advancing knowledge, possesses a remarkable ability to outlast time. More than 4 decades have now passed since Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg crossed the Canadian border expecting nothing more extraordinary than an ordinary trip through Washington state. The roads they traveled remain open. The forests, where investigators searched, have continued to grow, season after season, quietly reclaiming the landscapes that once became the focus of one of the Pacific Northwest's most significant homicide investigations. Time has altered nearly everything surrounding the case. Communities have expanded. Technology has transformed daily life. Entire generations have reached adulthood with little memory of the headlines that once dominated newspapers in both Canada and the United States. Yet the investigation itself has endured as one of the clearest demonstrations that carefully preserved evidence can outlast decades of uncertainty. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg occupy a unique place in modern criminal justice history because they represent the intersection of 2 eras. The investigation began at a time when detectives relied primarily upon witness interviews, physical evidence, and traditional forensic techniques. It concluded in an era where advanced DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy fundamentally expanded the ability of law enforcement to identify previously unknown offenders. The resolution of the case did not occur because investigators became more determined after 30 years. They had always been determined. It occurred because scientific progress finally reached the level required to unlock information that had been preserved since the first days of the investigation. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the case is that the decisive evidence was never hidden. It existed from the very beginning. Detectives recovered biological material during the original investigation. Crime scene technicians documented locations with care. Evidence custodians preserved exhibits according to professional standards. Every individual who handled the case contributed to protecting the integrity of that evidence, often without knowing whether it would ever produce meaningful results. Their work reflected a simple but essential belief shared by experienced investigators. Today's limitations should never determine tomorrow's possibilities. The investigation has since become an enduring lesson for homicide detectives throughout the world. Every unsolved case preserved in an evidence room represents more than unfinished paperwork. It represents unanswered questions that may one day become answerable through advances not yet imagined. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrates why agencies continue investing resources in evidence preservation, cold case reviews, and forensic research. Scientific innovation rarely eliminates the need for traditional investigative discipline. Instead, it rewards those investigations where evidence has been carefully protected and accurately documented over time. The case also illustrates the importance of institutional memory within law enforcement. Over more than 3 decades, detectives retired, supervisors changed, forensic laboratories adopted new technologies, and investigative procedures evolved. Yet the investigation remained intact because every generation preserved knowledge for the next. Reports written in 1987 remained relevant during courtroom proceedings decades later. Evidence inventories continued to guide forensic examinations. Chain of custody documentation maintained confidence in every laboratory result. Justice became possible because continuity survived despite the passage of time. Forensic science itself continues evolving. Techniques considered revolutionary today may appear limited to future generations, just as the methods available in 1987 seem modest compared with current capabilities. The investigation, therefore, serves not only as a historical example, but also as a reminder of the responsibility carried by today's investigators. Evidence collected now may someday be examined using technologies that have not yet been developed. The future success of those investigations will depend upon the professionalism demonstrated at the original crime scene. Beyond its scientific significance, however, the case ultimately returns to the people whose lives were forever changed. Jay Cook was 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18. They were remembered by family and friends as young people looking toward the future, making ordinary plans, and expecting to return home after a routine journey. Their names became associated with forensic history, not by choice, but because of the violence that interrupted those futures. Every discussion of investigative breakthroughs should therefore begin and end with the recognition that the purpose of forensic science is not technological achievement for its own sake. Its purpose is to seek the truth on behalf of victims who can no longer speak for themselves. The families who waded through decades of uncertainty demonstrated extraordinary resilience. They endured repeated investigative reviews, evolving forensic techniques, renewed media attention, and years in which progress seemed impossible. When scientific advances finally identified the offender, the legal process provided accountability supported by evidence rather than speculation. Although no verdict can erase loss, the investigation affirmed an important principle. The passage of time does not diminish the value of justice or the obligation to continue pursuing it. Today, the story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg is studied in police academies, forensic science programs, and criminal justice courses because it embodies many of the qualities that define successful long-term investigations: patience, precision, preservation, collaboration, scientific integrity, legal accountability. These principles, rather than dramatic breakthroughs alone, explain why one of North America's longest unsolved stranger homicides ultimately reached a courtroom after more than 30 years. As investigators continue reopening cold cases around the world, the legacy of this investigation remains profoundly relevant. Somewhere inside evidence vaults, laboratories, and archival files, other unanswered cases may contain the same hidden potential. A fingerprint too faint for yesterday's technology. A biological sample too small for earlier laboratories. A trace of evidence waiting for methods not yet invented. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation reminds every detective, forensic scientist, and prosecutor that the truth does not disappear simply because it cannot yet be seen. Sometimes it waits patiently, silently, and unchanged until knowledge advances enough to reveal it. In the end, the lasting significance of this case is not merely that it was solved after decades of uncertainty. Its true significance lies in what it proved. It proved that disciplined investigative work can outlive the investigators themselves. It proved that properly preserved evidence can survive generations. It proved that science and justice, advancing together over time, can succeed where earlier efforts could not. And above all, it proved that even after more than 40 years of silence, the voices of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were never truly lost. They endured within the evidence collected on those cold November days in 1987, waiting for the moment when science could finally tell their story with certainty and when the long search for truth could, at last, reach its rightful conclusion.